Today, I want to give you an overview of historic thinking about evolution. In talking about the fossil past, we need to understand that the world did not always look the way that it does now. In particular, continents used to be in different locations with different climates and vegetation, and this will be one of the topics of an upcoming lecture on plate tectonics. The significance for us is that the environment was changing. And as we'll learn, a changing environment means there was natural selection, resulting in variation. Let's begin with frameworks for studying human evolution. For much of human history, we look to creation myths, that is, stories that account for a society's origin. Creation myths often involve supernatural happenings. They provide an account of the origin of the world, they lay out a society's worldview and belief system, and they may explain social behavior. In this course, we will instead use the scientific method. This is a process by which phenomena are explained through observation and posing and testing hypotheses. What is a hypothesis? It's a tentative but testable explanation of relationships between certain phenomena or variables. How do scientists pick the best explanation? First, define the problem or question clearly. Then, list two or more alternative hypotheses. Develop and apply fair tests that could support two or more alternative solutions, but do not have the same basis as any of the alternative solutions. And you should examine criteria such as the strength of each fair test, the agreement among fair tests, and the strength of the alternative solutions. A theory is a hypothesis that has been well supported by evidence and testing. For example, the theory of gravity, atomic theory, or for our course, the theory of evolution, which explains how life developed and changed. Some people still mistakenly think that religious belief cannot coexist with scientific investigation. Scientific creationism is the belief that scientific evidence exists to support the biblical creation story, and that no evidence supports the theory of evolution. Despite its name, scientific creationism is not scientific. Another, called intelligent design, is the belief that life is too complex to have evolved naturally. It must have been designed by some intelligent entity. This is not a testable idea. It is something that must be taken on faith. We will instead rely on the scientific method. I'd like to provide some historical background for understanding the theory of evolution. Prior to 1859, the biblical framework of history, our creation myth, was the only acceptable way to view the past. In 1650, Archbishop Ussher counted the generations in Genesis and dated historic events in the Bible, and figured that the Earth began in 4004 BC. Not only that, it began at 9 a.m. on October 23rd if he meant to use the Julian calendar. He didn't tell us which calendar. Or October 22nd at nightfall if he was using the Jewish calendar. Archbishop Ussher interpreted the Bible literally. However, natural scientists and observers of the world around them began to question. They began scientific observations. Geologists saw evidence that the Earth had undergone tremendous changes. And how could these changes happen within just 6,000 years, they asked. Catastrophism explained change by saying that there had been a series of catastrophes, with Noah's flood the most recent. Catastrophism often looks for divine intervention. Versus Uniformitarianism, which says that change comes about through natural, observable processes, not unknown catastrophes. In other words, the rates and processes of change in the past were the same as they are now. The key here for using uniformitarianism to explain the origin of Earth is that given enough time. That is, it would take longer than 6,000 years for the amount of change that we see to have occurred. To summarize, two explanations have been offered to account for change in the world, that is, mountains eroding into plains. Catastrophism, sudden large changes, versus uniformitarianism, the rate of change remains the same as we can observe today. We accept the explanation of uniformitarianism, and given uniformitarianism, the world must be older than 6,000 years. Then people began to question whether life forms had changed. Linneaus, who devised a binomial system of nomenclature, was a creationist. Creationists believed that the world and all in it was divinely created all at once, with little or no change since then. But geologists saw fossils in rocks. Some of these fossils were of creatures that no longer existed. Geologists studied the stratigraphy, that is, the layering of rocks. They could identify strata, layers of rocks, and they noticed a sequence of events, especially in the fossils. So by the end of the 1700s, it was generally accepted that life forms had changed. But then people asked, well, how had life form changed? What were the mechanisms? Lamarck, a French naturalist, offered two explanations that are no longer accepted. One, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and two, evolution is progressive, from simple to more complex. But wait a minute, now we do see a little truth to the inheritance of acquired characteristics in the field of what we call epigenetics. Our present understanding comes from the work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with the theory of natural selection. The theory of natural selection states that organisms are adapted to their environment. Variation already exists. When environmental change occurs, those who are best adapted will survive. Those who do survive pass on their variation to their offspring. Thus, populations undergo adaptive change when the environment changes. Now, Darwin and Wallace didn't know by what mechanisms the variation they observed already existed, but we will talk about these genetic mechanisms in the coming weeks. However, there is no direction to evolution. Instead, organisms change as a result of natural selection through survival of the fittest. Up to now, I've outlined some history of thinking about geological and biological change. To review, geological change is explained by what? Uniformitarianism. Biological change is explained by what? Evolution. What about variation in people and their cultures? When Columbus returned to Lisbon, he took 7 kidnapped Arawak Taínos with him. In 1494, 600 American Indians were sent back to Europe as slaves, and Vespucci's first voyage brought back 222 Indians. With the discovery of the New World, that is, the Americas, it became difficult to fit these new people and the way they looked, the way they dressed, the way they spoke, into a biblical framework in terms of their origins. And believe it or not, a lot of people said these must be the lost tribes of Israel. Here's what happened to them. But the result of exploration was that Europeans were exposed to entirely new cultures, and there was increased interest in the past. People tried to fit what they saw into the 6,000-year limit. The Bible didn't talk about earlier stages of cultural or technological development. Thus, when people found artifacts, ancient tools on the ground, they were dismissed as natural. Perhaps they were thunderstorms, the result of where lightning struck the ground, or fairy stones, or tricks of nature. But evidence for human antiquity accumulated until 1859, when Darwin published On the Theory of Natural Selection. There followed a rapid and general acceptance of the idea that humans had been living on the Earth for longer than 6,000 years. Early anthropologists such as E.B. Tylor and Lewis Henry Morgan in the 1870s posited cultural evolution, stating that modern civilization developed from an initial primitive state, and Morgan laid out the stages as savagery, barbarism, and civilization. He thought that people or a society could get stuck at one stage. Anthropologists no longer accept these simplistic schemes of cultural evolution dating to the 1870s. But Tyler and Morgan were important in that they showed there had been cultural change as well as the biological and geological change demonstrated earlier. Anthropologists no longer use the terms savage, barbaric, and civilized. They've been out of date since before 1900, but the terms live on in popular cartoons and speech. To review, prior to 1859, many people believed the Earth was only 6,000 years old. However, now we know the Earth is much older than 6,000 years old. There has been change through time, not only in geology, landforms, but in organisms and also in cultures. This change has not been directional. Biological change occurs through evolution, and this course will adopt a scientific approach to the study of human evolution. In this first third of the course, we'll examine the basic causes or contributions to biological change. In the second section of the course, we'll examine specific biological changes, that is, evolution through time. And in the third and final section of the course, we'll examine cultural change and human biological diversity today. To review, frameworks for understanding human evolution have included historically creation myths, that is, stories that account for society's origin. Now, calling them a creation myth is not meant to be derogatory. It's simply a term that anthropologists use. The framework we will use is the scientific method, which is a series of observations. You propose hypotheses or tentative explanations to explain those observations, and you test your hypotheses against the evidence to support or disprove your hypothesis. I'd like to dispel the idea that science precludes religion. Many scientists are deeply religious, but neither scientific creationism nor intelligent design are scientific. In this course, we will rely on the scientific method. We recognize that the Earth has undergone tremendous change through time, and although catastrophes such as asteroid hits have affected all of life on Earth, we do not subscribe to catastrophism, which posits that all change occurred through a series of catastrophes that were divinely created. We will adopt instead the principle of uniformitarianism, which states that the rates and processes of change in the past were the same as they are now. We accept that not only has the world changed, life forms have also changed, as evidenced by changes in the fossil record. What is a fossil? Well, fossils are rocks. They may be mineralized organic remains, such as bones turned to rock, or they may be impressions, such as footprints. When people first recognized that life forms have changed, they didn't yet know how. They didn't know what were the mechanisms. I outlined the theory of natural selection. In 2 weeks, we'll begin to talk about how sexual reproduction can introduce genetic variety in organisms.